Peter proposed to Margaret on her 27th birthday. He took her on a picnic to a picturesque spot, and as the sun set on the water, he knelt down and said 4 magic words. Margaret, of course, agreed. She had been the last among her friends to remain single at her age, and it kept her on her toes. However, her life had now changed abruptly, and she was a wife. Peter insisted that she change her job, as he was not satisfied with her previous position. Although she was hesitant to leave and disappoint her coworkers, she eventually found a lucrative position with a new company. Margaret was grateful to her husband for pushing her to take this step. She had been working for the previous company since its inception 3 years ago. And this year, the management had decided to celebrate the anniversary of the branch. After work, Margaret decided to go shopping with her friend to pick out an outfit for the upcoming celebration, where even the executives from the head office were expected to attend. For the past week, all the women in the office had been discussing what outfits they would wear to the event. Margaret didn't want to stand out too much among her colleagues, but she also didn't want to blend into the background. She and her friend chose an elegant dress that emphasized her figure. When she got home, she showed the dress to her husband. He was preoccupied with his own thoughts, however, and barely glanced at the outfit, only nodding in approval. For the past 6 months, Peter had been under stress at work, which made him irritable and caused frequent quarrels with his wife. Margaret was tired of the constant tension, but tried to support him during difficult moments. However, Peter's behavior toward her became increasingly harsh. The turning point came on the night of the corporate event, just before Margaret left home. A domestic quarrel erupted into a heated argument with her husband. Margaret left their apartment, slamming the door with such force that Peter's ears rang. Arriving at the corporate party in a bad mood, and with a strong desire to drown her sorrows, Margaret took a seat at a table. She felt out of sorts and isolated, with no one to talk to. She only confided in one close colleague about her family problems and her reluctance to enjoy the party. The colleague nodded sympathetically and patted Margaret on the back, which only made her feel worse. She had always hated being pitied, a feeling instilled in her by her mother, who believed that only weak people sought pity. As the evening wore on and after drinking a whole bottle of wine, Margaret's mood began to improve. Watching the guests and her superiors having fun, she noticed that people had gone dancing and invited her to join them. She declined, however, citing fatigue from her high heels. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the tables were cleared, a man approached her. It was one of the head office managers who had come to celebrate the branch's anniversary with the staff. Margaret responded to the greeting and a casual conversation ensued between them. Although she wasn't in the mood to talk, she answered briefly and politely so that her boss wouldn't think she was being rude. In fact, Anthony, as he introduced himself, seemed quite attractive to her. Anthony was handsome and well-dressed. Margaret had noticed him at the very beginning of the event and had been discreetly observing him. His good manners, expensive suit, and attractive facial features made him appealing to any woman. As Anthony sat next to her, a daring idea occurred to Margaret. Under the influence of alcohol and driven by a desire to get back at her husband for ruining the evening, she decided she would sleep with her boss. She later wondered where this idea had come from. She had never considered infidelity before and had always disapproved of those who engaged in it. "Are you married?" she suddenly asked in the midst of their conversation. Shocked by her direct question, he replied that he was single. Daringly, Margaret offered him some privacy. Strangely, at that moment, she did not think about the possible consequences of such a proposal, like the fact that she could lose her job. She was more concerned that Anthony might politely decline so as not to offend her. Mustering up her courage, she asked the impertinent question. With a sly look, he leaned closer and whispered, "Where are we going?" His whisper sent shivers down Margaret's spine. The situation was both exciting and unfamiliar. She suggested they head to the restroom first, and he could discreetly join her so as not to attract attention. Agreeing with a nod, he waited for her next move. In a state of alcoholic intoxication, Margaret stumbled out of the hall and headed for the bathroom. She looked at herself in the mirror, assessed her appearance, and then closed the door behind her. Anthony knocked discreetly, and she let him in. As Margaret drove home later, she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. On one hand, she felt a sense of satisfaction for having avenged her husband for his constant quarreling and for ruining her mood that evening. On the other hand, she felt terrible, and the more sober she became, the worse she felt. Waking up the next morning with a piercing headache, she prepared herself for the inevitable shame. Opening her eyes, she realized she wasn't in bed, but on the couch. To her surprise, Peter was standing in the doorway, looking at her reproachfully. Struggling with the pain in her head, Margaret lifted herself up and noticed she was still dressed in yesterday's outfit. The dress had slid down, and she was horrified to find she was no longer wearing tights or underwear. She wondered if Anthony had taken them as some sort of trophy or souvenir from the night before. Not knowing what to say to her husband's unspoken questions, she simply pulled the blanket over herself. Margaret stared silently in front of her, unable to find the words to explain. Peter's anger erupted and he started screaming, trying to forcefully lift Margaret off the couch. "Get out!" he shouted, throwing derogatory comments in her direction. In response, Margaret screamed back, tears streaming down her face. "This is your fault. I'm tired of our constant fighting. You're being hysterical. I'll leave on my own, so don't fire me." With these words, Margaret jumped up, and an hour later was sitting in a cab, heading to her friend's house. She had nowhere else to go. All the way there, she sobbed in the back seat. The driver, sensing her distress, didn't ask any questions but silently handed her a pack of tissues. After the divorce, Margaret borrowed some money and left town, tormented by the memories associated with Peter, and more importantly, with herself. She was fired from her job, and Anthony had a hand in it. As a result, Margaret had been subtly pushed into writing her resignation letter. She deeply regretted her actions, which had led to so much trouble. Soon after her first interview, she found a new job, but she didn't like it. However, she had no choice. She had to make a living and pay back her debts. Left alone in a strange city, in a job she didn't like, she realized the gravity of her mistakes, but it was too late to turn back the clock. Cheating Secrets podcasts like me.